Okay, my English teacher friends, I have a fantastic synthesis essay for you today up my sleeve, and it's called To Prompose or Not to Prompose, and I'll tell you the impetus and the backstory to this. So we have our homecoming dance within the first 3 weeks of school. We return the day after Labor Day. So the end of September is our homecoming dance. And last year, we wasted a ton of time deliberating over whether or not certain students should prompose to other students. And it just seemed to be the center of our conversation in those early weeks of school, which sort of thwarted my instructional delivery to some extent. So I'm like, hey, why not kill two birds, one stone? We can figure out whether or not to prompose and also learn the art of synthesis. So what I've done is created a really interesting prompt to get us anchored in this. I have supplementary articles for this as well, and they are in the description link. I have a little Google Doc. You can click that link and access the source material if you want, and you also can access the slides that you're going to be seeing throughout this writing workshop. So here's the prompt. It states, Sam, a sparkly and introspective junior in high school, is weighing the pros and cons of promposing to their longtime crush, Riley. Ever since the 6th grade, Sam has been infatuated with Riley, but has kept this crush under tight secrecy. Read the following sources and accompanying contextual information carefully. Write a letter to Sam that addresses the following essential question: to prompose or not to prompose. In your essay, synthesize material from at least 3 sources to develop your position. And just for context, this coming school year, I have on-level juniors. I'm in New York State, and we just call them Regents students. They're working towards a Gen Ed Regents diploma. I also have AP Lang, AP Lit. And I plan on running this with my AP Lang students and my 11 Regents section. So I will do, tackle annotations and Harkness discussions a little differently depending on which class I'm doing. And of course, you got a knack for that. You can figure that out all on your own in terms of where your kids' skill levels are at with those particular things. But with my AP Lang kids, I plan on running through that process very quickly. With the on-level juniors, it takes a little bit of time to teach annotation and how to make sure that their textual support is totally aligned with their first premises in order to sustain that line of reasoning. Before we look at how to cobble this essay together, I want to say this, all right? I'm always toting the following question. What if we taught composition like Bob Ross teaches painting? And when I ask that question, it comes down to this. You got to Bob Ross your instruction. So what I'm going to show you are a ton of models and exemplars that I wrote for my students in order to demystify the process. Bob Ross, little known fact about Bob Ross is that he used heuristics, and I typically call my templates heuristics, but nobody knows what a heuristic is, it seems, so I just by default call it templates, but they're more or less heuristics. He used something called wet on wet technique. And every single time my students engage in expository writing, whether it be synthesis, straight up argument, persuasion, rhetorical analysis, literary analysis, as far as the introductory paragraph goes, we can declare or invert. Those are my 2 templates for the introductory paragraph. And all body paragraphs can be written syllogistically. And throughout the course of this writing workshop, I'm going to model and unpack how to do all of those things. So our first question, all right, let's just presume that we've read the articles, we've annotated, we have a working thesis in our head, we know which stance we're going to take. So it's either yes prompose, no prompose, or you qualify it. Those are like the 3 rhetorical positions one can take with this particular prompt, which we see often on the college board exam for the AP language exam. Yes, no, or it depends. It seems to be a very common approach at arriving at a thesis. So when we ask the question, so How do I write the introductory paragraph? I've already alluded to this. We can declare or invert. So let's unpack the declarative thesis template first. You can begin with the thesis, and that's what I mean by declare. You just come out and roar. You declare the thesis. So immediately give the advice. Prompose, don't prompose, or qualify it. From there, you want to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background. And there's caveats to that. I tell my students, don't mention the sources, don't quote, don't paraphrase. Your argument must be central. So it's just the context and the background of their central idea. I also like to see my students incorporate a tad bit of tier 2 level vocabulary. We know that we're speaking to a friend, so we don't want to totally geek out, but it is an academic paper, so I do want to see a little bit of tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. I run intensive word study academies throughout the duration of the year, so my students will, at the time of writing this, will have only had me for about 2 or 3 weeks, so I expect there to be a bit of a vocabulary void. But I do want them to experiment with their vocabulary a little bit, but stay in their wheelhouse, right? Stay in your lane. Don't invent words. Don't, have the concept that using million dollar words is the equivalent of good writing, but elevate it just a little bit. Sentence constructs is something that comes from my Nuance Academy. We use a text called Strunk and White, Write It Right. And in it, they have something called rule number 18, which makes the assertion that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a sentence. So in order to achieve voice, rhythm, and flow, I'm going to have my students experiment with their sentence constructs to avoid what struggling and emerging writers typically do, is stack independent clauses atop each other so that it creates that droning da-dot, 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 da-dot kind of rhythm. Early in the academic year, I want to draw my students' attention to that tendency and begin to drop the seed of you got to break that parallelism in your writing. And then all of my theses templates are exactly 4 sentences long. No more, no less, exactly 4 sentences. Now, we can flip this and go the inverted route. And in this case, you begin with the context background, maybe a hook, maybe an analogy, and I'll model how to do that. It's a clever way to do it, and sometimes kids fall on their faces when they try it. So I really, challenge my students to know themselves as writers to see if they have the poetic muse to be able to pull that off. And the 4th sentence is going to be the thesis statement. So you end. Same stuff, context, background, and again, adhere to the do nots. Do not quote, do not paraphrase, do not mention the source articles at all. Keep the centrality of your argument at all times. We're going to incorporate a little bit of tier 2, focus on those sentence constructs, exactly 4 sentences long. All right, this is a promposal essay. So let's bust out some exemplars and models. Let's get dancing here. So student number 1 steps to the plate. And again, I wrote these just to demystify it for kids. I always tell teachers when I work with them at the National Writing Project or with NCTE, position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom. The more you model, the more you demystify things, and the more you enable your students to grow and mature as writers. So this one I wrote. So let's break it down and see how I approach it using my template. Hi, Sam. My grandfather, who was a professional lion trainer in the circus, lived by the following adage: if it don't feel right, get the hell out of the cage as fast as you can. Clearly, given what you know about Riley's disposition, their likes and dislikes, promposing does not feel aligned with either them or you. So why force the issue? In other words, run like hell and find another means to express your intent. Otherwise, this whole thing could implode with disastrous results. So you can see there I'm ending with the thesis. So this is a classic inverted. I start with that hook or an analogy, which is, again, very skillful, very difficult to do. I just in my 21 years of experience, I see a lot of students try this, which is admirable, but they have a hard time pulling it off. So whatever, anecdote or metaphor juxtaposition that's created has to connect to the thesis, and that's the big thing, is to thread those two things together. So that story about my grandfather ties nicely into the expression of the thesis. You can see here that the sentence constructs are all very varied. I'm using things like dashes and ellipses. I got a rhetorical question in there, some adjective clauses, some stutter stops, which is always nice for the voice, the rhythm, and the flow. So the big thing is, I tell my students, be careful not to parallel your sentence constructs. That's usually when you develop that droning rhythm, is when you get the parallelism in there. And if they parallel, they have to have a purpose. They have to be able to explain it. So typically in the introduction, I don't tend to parallel all that often. So you can see there's some nice words in here like intent, aligned, implode, not overdoing it, staying in my lane, staying in my wheelhouse. But it's all there. 4 sentences, end with the thesis, context, background. And again, look what does not go in there. No quoting, no paraphrasing, no mention of the sources. And of course, to meet the demands of the assignment, I have to write it in a letter format, which I did here. So, all right. Just to really, really shore this up and demystify it, let's paint another one. Let's do it all over again. So again, this one is likewise mine. I wrote this. Dear Sam, and we talked about the greeting, the salutation sets the tone, right? So if I say, hey there, buddy, something of that nature, then it kind of belies where I'm going, the direction I'm going. So that greeting, the salutation, is really important to think about. So I modeled that for my students. Dear Sam, given that you've nursed your crush for Riley ever since the 6th grade, my advice is to shoot big and go with the biggest and best promposal of them all. So you can see I've answered the essential question in that first sentence. So this one, by definition, is a declarative thesis. So look where it goes in terms of the context and background. Pay attention to the tier 2. Pay attention to the sentence constructs. To express a big love in a big way is the only option. The bigger you go, the more likely they are to say yes. So I say shoot for the moon and stars. And it can be as simple as that. That's just a nuts and bolts, straight up thesis statement. There's no, thrills, chills, no fireworks to that. It's just really basic. So I know, especially at the 11R level, that I'm going to have, a glut of struggling and emerging writers. And I find the declarative approach to be the easiest. So when I have a student, after I've modeled this, 5, 6 times, staring at a blank sheet of paper or their blank Chromebook, and I'll say, hey, what's your answer to the essential question? And they begin to articulate it, and I go over, tap them on the shoulder and say, boom, write it down, just like that. You've just articulated a thesis statement, and then flesh it out with 3 sentences of context and background, and that tends to do the trick. So that was just a straight up declarative. We can paint some more to really, really, really unpack this and demystify it. Yes, you can, students. You can do this. It's really easy. Here's one more. My dear friend, my advice is this, : eliminate all cheesiness and express your intent in the most authentically genuine way that feels aligned with your heart. Clearly, you're not one who is comfortable with grandiose displays of public affection. And given what you know about Riley, they'd probably be mortified if you promposed in some hyped up demonstrative way. Play things out real cool and suave and do something that expresses the tenderness of your soul. All right, so either way, it doesn't matter. Thesis up top, thesis in the bottom, just context, background. This has real nice tier 2 in it. I liked words like authentically genuine, aligned, displays, mortified. Real good words like that, tenderness. But you can also notice in here, given the levity of the prompt, that I'm inviting kids to use a little bit of colloquial and vernacular in here as well. So in this academic paper, this kid, it's me, I'm just saying I'm a student in Mr. Kuhn's class, used the word cheesiness. I really want to point that out to my students, that I want them to sound like they're 16, 17, but an elevated 16, 17-year-old. So sometimes I've noticed in looking at College Board sample papers, the kids that can really teeter-totter a tad bit of colloquial vernacular with the tier 2 get the sophistication point. Sometimes I think that's necessary, and it's a good, practice exercise here to show them that they don't have to be overly pedantic. They can be themselves and have a little bit of spunkiness and playfulness in their tone. All right, let's paint one more. Let's really, really, really demystify this for our students. Here's another one that I wrote. And again, note the greeting, note the salutation. Howdy, Sam. So you kind of know where I'm going with this one, right? So, question for you. And I'm modeling for my students how to use, different punctuation, expressive syntax. So in all of these, you're seeing me use colons, semicolons, and dashes because I'm teaching that in my Nuance Academy around this time of the year. So question for you, colon. Do you want to be a mindless lemming who follows the masses blindly? Semicolon. Or do you want to express your heart in the purest and most authentic of ways? Given what we both know about Riley, they value people who march to the beat of their own drummer. In knowing this, you need to be you and show your true face. As such, I suggest you go with the biggest and best promposal the world has ever seen. So the answer to the essential question comes last, so this is inverted. And I'm just showing them here a good concrete example of how to use expressive syntax, how to manipulate the sentence constructs, have some syntactical flair in it. And again, I don't want them overdoing it. I'm just showing them some examples for consideration. So this one does the exact same thing as all the others. 4 sentences, context, background, tier 2, sentence constructs. All right. Happy little intros. Let's do one more just to really, really, really shore this up. Hey there, good buddy. Prompose now already, will you? And again, I just want to show kids, like my real emerging, struggling writers, that it's this basic. You don't need, big fireworks and big displays. Just say it. If you're having trouble out of the gates, just say the thesis. You've been suppressing this crush for years and holding the secret to yourself. Let the cat out of the bag. Muster up all the moxie, gumption, and courage at your disposal and march into the cafeteria tomorrow during lunch and announce your intentions to the God Almighty world, right? So I'm just having fun with this, and I want my kids to have fun with it as well. We're just practicing, getting them really used to my templates in a fun, playful, engaging way. And even though this sounds a tad different than the others, it's doing the exact same thing. So again, either thesis first or thesis last, context, background, tier 2, sentence constructs. I like words like moxie and gumption. Just having fun with it. Just showing them how to, wield this template, make sure that they're getting the thesis point, and crushing things out of the gate. So that's the top secret to this template. Either declare or invert. And I lied. I got one more for you just to really, really demystify it. Hi, Sam. Knowing what this means to you, I suggest you lay out all the variables. So that does not answer the essential question, right? So this is probably going to be inverted, I hope. First, you are reserved for the most part and shy. Riley is likewise on the timid and introverted side of things. Given this, I'd avoid a public proclamation at all costs and find an approach that more closely matches both of your personalities and styles. So that was done perfectly. It's a perfect inverted thesis. And again, note the don'ts. This is one of the pitfalls and snafus of student writing. They lose the centrality of their argument in that opening introductory paragraph by piggybacking too closely the source material. So I don't want to hear any thesis that's rooted in somebody else's voice. Only student voice in this introductory 4 sentences. And this one does the same, tier 2, sentence constructs, really good voice rhythm flow in this last exemplar as well. All right, so intros are done. If you're writing with me, if I'm teaching this class with your students, I'd pause the video here and have your students write their introductions and then peer edit them. Have your students share their work with other students. I'm a big contender of this. The more writing students see, the better they become. And oftentimes in traditional grading paradigms, the teacher's the only one that sees the students writing. And I think that really is a disadvantage to students. Have them see writing, have them volunteer their work to be displayed whole class. Students can break it down and offer feedback. I do that all the time, and it really helps kids grow and mature as writers. All right, next question, because we're done with the intro. So, how do I write the body paragraphs? And for those that are familiar with my template, you know that we can use the syllogistic method. I'm going to glance through this quickly because I go over this extensively in a lot of my other videos. So for those that are new to my body paragraph template of the syllogistic method, you might want to backtrack and take a look at some videos where I go over this a little bit more thoroughly, but I'll give you a working knowledge just so that it's nice and easy for you. So the syllogistic method is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and they would often throw out these big essential questions, just like we're doing, but with a little bit more pith. So one such example would be, what is justice, which is the essential question of the seminal text, Plato's Republic. And the philosophers and the scholars would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And they would do their own form of pure editing. The scholars, the philosophers would unpack what that particular person said and they would find the bullet holes in it. And the next person would go up thinking they were offering a better definition. And Aristotle, like us composition instructors, noted some students are better at this than others. And he wanted to open up the lid of the really good orators and say, what are they doing with regards to their internal machinations? How are they cloaking? How are they structuring these arguments? And one day he got it. He had his eureka moment. He said, aha, there's like a mathematical calculative formula when they construct good arguments. So a syllogism is when you're working from premise to conclusion. And I'll give you one example here. It's kind of morbid. It's kind of a morbid example, but you'll see what I mean by this. So if I say premise one, arsenic is deadly, we'd all nod our heads and say, yep, Christian, you are absolutely right. But then if I follow it up with a second premise that reads as such, my dog ate arsenic, we naturally are going to conclude that this is not going to bode well for the dog. My dog is going to die. Right? That's logic. That's what Aristotle called cogency. And when students write, we want them to be that locked in and that deliberate and have all three parts of their line of reasoning. And I'll model this extensively in just a second here. So what do we do with this syllogistic method in terms of making it a template for the purposes of writing synthesis? It's this easy. The first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. So up top in the thesis, we don't state why. We just say yes, no, or qualify, right? We don't give any whys. So the why is going to come in the first premise. This is always a 3-sentence move in order to keep the centrality of the argument. So a lot of teachers and students are used to topic sentence. Think of the first premise as topic sentences, 3 of them. And I'll model this extensively in just a second. The second premise, we have to keep in mind that we have to use the sources. We have a minimum requirement. So we're going to offer our textual support in the second premise in the form of quoting and paraphrasing. And we're going to teeter-totter balance those two out. We don't want to do one far more at the expense of the other. And then we also have to keep in mind that body paragraphs need to be concluded. You just can't end on a quote and run like hell out of that body paragraph. You have to conclude the paragraph. Just like you need a conclusion body paragraph or a conclusion paragraph for the essay, you got to conclude paragraphs by linking, echoing, and making sure that you keep the promise of the first premise. So let's break this down bit by bit. How do I write a first premise. So let's take a look at those first 3 sentences, and then we'll put the whole thing together. So I have stems that I like to use for the first premise. And oftentimes, even though I say you got to state a why reason, students don't know what I mean by that. So for training wheel purposes, for like a real easy scaffold to keep this within the palm of students' hands, use very simple sentence stems like this. There is a clear reason as to why. So there is a clear reason as to why you should prompose immediately, right? And then state your reason why and do it in 3 sentences. There are a couple of reasons why you should. So if it's got a multifaceted face to it, say couple, right? You don't want to load the reasons because, you don't have, endless time to do this. Syllogistic body paragraphs, as you're going to see in a second, they're bigger than those 4 to 5 sentence baggers that students typically write. Syllogistic body paragraphs are like 10 to 12 sentences. So again, the first 3 sentences are going to be the first premise. So let's take a look at one in its entirety. Again, this is just the first premise, 3 sentences, why reason. So here's how this first one reads. There are a few reasons why you should go big or go home. First, a love such as yours must not be expressed on a small scale. And second, Riley is the type of person deserving of only the best and extravagant proposals known to the history of mankind. So I call this the enumerated approach. So students say, a couple or a few reasons why, and then they enumerate with first and second, just like this. So now, in terms of moving to the second premise, we would need quotes and paraphrases tied to the first, and quotes and paraphrases tied to the second. And that's an easy, gimmicky way to make sure that the line of reasoning stays perfectly intact. All right, let's paint some more pretty little rainbows and clouds and butterflies and bees and show that first premise all over again using the same sentence stems. So here it is. The reasons why you need to exercise discretion are quite clear. First, Riley is like the biggest nonconformist in the world. So you really can't follow the masses on this one and unfurl a cheeseball promposal. Second, you both hate being in the spotlight. So again, I used that enumerated approach. Same things as the introduction, still focusing on that tier 2, still focusing on the sentence constructs. That's going to stay static throughout the entire paper. But this is just a real kind of scaffolded training wheel way to make sure that all of your students are able to write that why reason. Especially this is, the first synthesis paper of the year. Some kids are going to need that level of scaffolding. And I'm thinking in particular, my on-level juniors, my AP Lang students, probably not so much. So let's remove the training wheels and make it less gimmicky and less formulaic, and just say the why reason without all of that, training wheel stuff. So look at this one. During our formative years, there are just a handful of wonderful rites of passage, and going to the prom just so happens to be one such event. The pressure to not screw this up is enormous. I get that. But in acknowledging this, you need to be yourself. And clearly, you are not one given to showmanship and being in the spotlight. So that articulates a clear why reason without using the reason why, without expressly stating reason why. So what do we do next? What's after the first premise? Well, here's what I do when I write. I call it quote hunting. I read my first premise and I say, what is the promise of the first premise? Because that's the line of reasoning right there. Keeping the promise of the first premise is how you ensure that you have a cogent line of reason from start to finish in each body paragraph. So I got to go find all the quotes and or paraphrases that I will need to sustain that cogent line of reasoning and to ensure that I keep the promise of the first premise. So let's go quote hunting, right? What I usually do is I put one first premise on the board or on the overhead, and then I have the students go quote hunting for me, and then I write the rest of the syllogism on the spot. It's good practice. They can see how to quote with deliberation and not be so willy-nilly and arbitrary about quote selection, and it just really shores up and solidifies how to do that process, because that's typically where line of reasoning falls apart, is the quotes aren't germane to the promise of the first premise. So that's the big thing I want to emphasize here. Keep your promise, right? If you keep your promise, then you absolutely will sustain the line of reasoning from top to bottom. So let me show you the whole thing, all right? The whole syllogistic body paragraph. Again, we're going to shoot for 10 to 12 sentences. First 3 sentences are going to articulate the why reason. Since this is the first synthesis paper of the year, I'm going to use the sentence stem. I'm going to keep the scaffolds up. So here's my first premise. The reasons why you need to exercise discretion are quite clear. First, Riley is like the biggest nonconformist in the world, so you really can't follow the masses on this one and unfurl a cheeseball promposal. Second, you both hate being in the spotlight. So let's break this down. It says, first, Riley's like the biggest nonconformist in the world, so you really can't follow the masses on this one and unfurl a cheeseball promposal. So I know in the source pack there's a whole bunch of stuff in there about conformity, certain characteristics of being extroverted, introverted. So those articles, those sources are going to be good for the first. Second says you both hate being in the spotlight. I have some articles in there where proposals and actually marriage proposals went totally off the rails because the person didn't like being in the spotlight, and the language of the article says that the person felt assaulted, like they were like being assaulted by the public display. So that one article is going to be very good for the second. So I need to quote from that article. Let's move to the fourth sentence. I've indicated all parts here. So the second premise begins in the fourth sentence, and I tell my students, immediately get to quoting and paraphrasing in the fourth sentence and keep that line of reasoning intact. So look where this goes. Given that you are so intimately aware of Riley's love language and how they like to express and receive attention, it's important that you not approach the proposal by doing what you want, but what they want. And that's a quote from source A. Let's talk about quote transitions here. Easy template for this one. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places 5 words before the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. I don't like hearing abrupt quote transitions, and that 5-word rule tends to do the trick. You notice that I used a bracket there. That's something that needs to be taught. My students will liberally learn to use brackets so that everything sounds conversational. So we got source A, we have our first quote, but we got to analyze it. So look at the transition out of the quote. Just to remind you, in factoring all the variables, in this situation, your needs, wants, and desires come second to Riley's. And something of great importance to consider, Riley's is very grounded and down to earth. A promposal simply is way too over the top for a person like them and feels like a conformist, trendy cliche. So you can see I'm moving into number 2, the second. Let's get a quote or paraphrase for that. Further, Riley does not have the standard expectation at 15 for being asked out on a date, which includes a pool float, donuts, and a choreographed flash mob, source C. So typically in a body paragraph, I will quote 2 to 3 times. That's a question that students often ask. Mr. Kuhn, how many quotes do I need per body paragraph? I usually do 2 or 3, but you got to keep in mind the first promise used that enumerated approach of first and second. So by simple definition, you need 2 quotes for that. All right, so we got to continue this. It goes on, so I ran out of space there. The scenario you are weighing kind of goes to the old adage. If everyone else is jumping off the bridge, will you? Please do not take the plunge into the waters of certain rejection and failure. Take as an example David, who once he got into a relationship knew he had to step his game up and do a kick-ass proposal, source F. So I'm just showing my students how to weave those sources in, keep the line of reasoning. But look how I get out of that quote. Again, you always have to analyze your quotes. Break down the logic here. He's in a secure and loving relationship, yet feels compelled to do a grandiose proposal. Clearly, one needs to consider his motivations. Come to find out, David's intentions were a bit askew in that it completely embarrassed her. That was the point, and everyone else loved it. Source F. So that's plenty of second premise right there. Okay. We have tons of support and analysis. I'm going over 12 sentences, I think, by 2 sentences here. I think this whole thing is 14 sentences. That's fine. I'm just modeling, just Bob Rossing how to do this. But look how you throw the conclusion onto this. All right. So we got to wrap up the body paragraph, and this usually just takes 2 to 3 sentences. And I usually throw it all back to the prompt, all back to the thesis in the conclusion. Please do yourself a favor and avoid humiliating not only Riley, but yourself. Ratchet down the expectations and meet Riley where they are at, right at the center of their core being. Anything less than this is certain to lead to a big fat rejection and a ton of embarrassment. So again, as I already admitted, I went over the 12 sentences, but the line of reasoning stays intact. It's fine to have, a big paragraph, but clearly 4 or 5 sentences body paragraphs are not going to have enough support and analysis to really flesh out the line of reasoning and to substantiate in clear terms that argument from the first premise. So that's an example of one syllogistic body paragraph. Again, note the tier 2 in that, note the sentence constructs, the same rules apply. Big thing, line of reasoning stays intact. All right, I'm scratching my head, and you might be scratching your head too. What do I do next? It's easy. You bust out another syllogism. My essays, when my students for AP, both Lit and Lang, they only write 4-paragraph essays. Intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. Given that the body paragraphs are so big, they don't need that third body paragraph, right? I find kids that write the 4 or 5 sentence baggers need the 5-paragraph format. Kids that are writing syllogistically, with an inverted or a declarative thesis, 4 paragraphs is totally substantial. So it gets the job done. So I'm just going to keep this simple 4-paragraph essay. Let's look at one more example here. Same thing. You're going to reload, have a first premise that's 3 sentences long. And I'm just going to show the flip side of this. It seems to me like this is an all or nothing proposition. This is why you must go big or go home. Given that you've had a massive crush on Riley ever since the 6th grade, you know that anything less than something grandiose just won't cut it. Further, a big love such as yours necessitates an even bigger expression of it. All right, so if we break this down into the language of a promise, clearly it's simply stating go big or go home. So we have to get into the sources that talk about going big, like making this special. It's a rite of passage, right? You have to have something extravagant in this day and age for your prospective partner to say yes. So second premise begins 4th sentence, and we're going to immediately get quoting and paraphrasing. Even some of our peers who are already in committed relationships, like David, realize that once you're in a relationship, you have to step up your game and do a kick-ass proposal, source F. And this is cool because I used that quote in the first exemplar, right? And I'm showing students the actual flip side of it, which is pretty neat. But same technique here. We quote, we paraphrase, 5-word rule. We got to analyze the quote. A big promposal is what people expect nowadays, and nothing less than big will do for Riley. It's all about the fantasy and the allure of being pursued. Take as an example Donica, who asserts that it has been engraved in our teenage dreams that our stud for a boyfriend or the chiseled boy in the front of the class would come and awkwardly ask you to prompt. Source F. Let me tell you point blank, be that chiseled stud and coordinate something extraordinary in terms of your promposal. Several people have taken the lead on this, so let's take a look at a few examples, few stellar examples. Peter, a junior in Boise, Idaho, parachuted onto the football field during the homecoming game and choreographed a flash mob to express his interest in Samantha, the head cheerleader. Source I. Well, everyone told Peter that he had no chance. Samantha later stated that she said yes because the stunt was adorably romantic, something far beyond the boring and timid request of Brad, the star quarterback. Source I. So again, I'm just showing students how to do that 5-word rule, keep the line of reasoning, tier 2 sentence constructs. But just like the first one, we can't end on a quote. We got to throw it all back to the prompt, all back to the thesis. So syllogisms come full circle. Clearly, if it worked in this situation, it definitely will work on Riley. While you probably don't need to jettison yourself from a plane, you nonetheless need to think big and act quickly. All right, and again, that's all 10 to 12 sentences. That line of reasoning is perfect. It's straight. Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion, right? Arsenic is deadly. My dog ate arsenic. My dog is going to die. It follows the exact same template. So again, if you're writing with me, pause here and do it bit by bit. Start with that first premise, go quote hunting, and cobble it all together. Make sure you got a conclusion on it. Keep it all in 10 to 12 sentences. And as always, sprinkle in those tier 2s. Don't overdo it. Focus on those sentence constructs for voice, rhythm, and flow. But we are not done. We're only 3 paragraphs in. We need that conclusion paragraph. So let's take a look at a few of my favorite sentence stems. One favorite stem that my students tend to gravitate towards is this. Simply said, comma. And then they just conclude in about 3 sentences. So let's see what I did here. Simply said, you can either be a mindless lemming and follow all the other conforming herd, or you can be your authentic self. Clearly, you know the direction you need to take to get the answer you want to hear. This is my advice. Take it or leave it. And that's all you need to do to summarize everything and bring your essay full circle, is just a simple stem like that. Simply said, comma. I have a few others that I'll share with you. And my students use these on all of their essays regardless of the expository mode. Evidentially, comma. In no other words, comma. When it is all said and done, comma. At the end of the day, comma. So my students steal those stems and just finish. And typically the conclusion, we tend to do it in 3 to 4 sentences. I really don't think you need to go above and beyond that. So any of those 5 sentence stems will do for you and your students. And rock and roll. That's the essay. So we are at the end. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, want to give me any feedback on this, let me know how it goes in your classroom. Want to share some student writing with me and my students? Hit me up at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Also know I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, a contributor to NCTE, and if you go to my webpage, www.teachinghowtowrite.com, there's a tab up there that says My NWP Courses. National Writing Project and I have teamed up, and throughout the entire calendar year, we offer a slew of PDs. Some are free and some come with a nominal fee. I think NWP is one of the most affordable PDs out there, and they come with great name recognition, and you get your PD hours when you work with NWP if you need that for certification purposes. So click that tab and see what we are currently offering. If you have any questions, again, drop me an email, or you can reach out directly to NWP. So those professional developments are awesome, and read the reviews. We always get very good reviews, and people are very happy with what we do. So I'm signing off. Happy teaching, Happy writing. I hope this serves you well and gets you through prom or homecoming or the Sadie dance season. All right, take care. Be well.